The fallow fields of discontent, seeds of rebellion in the colonies. The year 1763 marked a curious and temporary zenith for the British Empire in North America. The recent triumph over France in the 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, had secured the vast continental interior for the crown, extinguishing the threat of French encroachment forever. The colonists, having fought alongside the British regulars, celebrated their victory, believing a new era of peace and prosperity, bolstered by British strength, had begun. Yet this very victory contained the bitter seeds of discontent that would sprout into revolution barely a decade later. For many years, the American colonies had operated under a system often termed salutary neglect. The British government, preoccupied with European wars and the logistics of a global empire, found it convenient to allow the colonies a considerable degree of self-rule. Local assemblies, like the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Massachusetts General Court, exercised real power, taxing their own citizens and managing internal affairs. This tradition had bred a population fiercely protective of its autonomy and ingrained with the belief that they possessed all the fundamental rights of Englishmen, including the right to be taxed only by their elected representatives. The war debt, however, was staggering, and British policy abruptly shifted. The new philosophy in London, championed by Prime Minister George Grenville and successive ministries, held that the American colonies should contribute financially to the upkeep of the empire, particularly the standing army now required to police the newly acquired territories and enforce the proclamation line of 1763. The first major jolt to the established order came with the Sugar Act of 1764. While ostensibly a revenue-raising measure, it was its enforcement that alarmed the colonial merchants and lawyers. It tightened customs regulations, increased the number of ships patrolling the coast, and, most crucially, allowed for customs violations to be tried in admiralty courts without a jury. This was a direct assault on the cherished British right to trial by one's peers. James Otis, Jr., a prominent lawyer in Massachusetts, railed against these acts, famously arguing for no taxation without representation, a phrase that would quickly become the rallying cry of the resistance. But the powder keg was truly ignited by the Stamp Act of 1765. This was an internal tax, a levy not on trade, but on virtually every piece of paper required for public and commercial life: legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and even academic degrees. Unlike previous acts, this tax reached deep into the lives of every literate colonist, uniting powerful legal elites, influential journalists, and common tavern keepers in immediate, visceral opposition. The resistance to the Stamp Act demonstrated the revolutionary potential of unified colonial action. In the political sphere, the Virginia Resolves, introduced by the young, fiery orator Patrick Henry, declared that the Colonial Assembly alone had the power to tax Virginians. Henry's bold defense of colonial rights was so radical that some of his resolves were rejected by the more moderate burgesses, yet they were printed and circulated throughout the colonies, fueling the fire of resistance. The most effective action, however, was coordinated in the streets by groups like the Sons of Liberty. Founded in Boston and quickly establishing cells across the major colonial ports, the Sons of Liberty were a clandestine network composed primarily of artisans, tradesmen, and waterfront laborers. Their leader in Boston was Samuel Adams, a gifted political organizer who understood how to channel popular resentment into focused action. The Sons of Liberty's strategy was simple and ruthless: make the Stamp Act completely unenforceable through intimidation and economic pressure. They targeted the appointed stamp distributors. In Boston, Andrew Oliver was their first victim. An effigy of Oliver was hung from a large elm tree that quickly became known as the Liberty Tree. Later, a violent mob destroyed the stamp office and thoroughly ransacked Oliver's house. Fearing for his life and property, Oliver publicly resigned his commission the next day. The same pattern was repeated in colonies from New York to South Carolina. Facing threats of tarring, feathering, and property destruction, every appointed stamp distributor in America resigned before the law could even take effect. The political and economic resistance coalesced in the Stamp Act Congress in New York City in October 1765. Delegates from 9 colonies gathered, a momentous, unprecedented show of colonial unity, to issue a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This document asserted the colonists' allegiance to the king, but vehemently denied the authority of Parliament to tax them without their consent. Simultaneously, merchants organized wide-ranging non-importation agreements, boycotting British goods. The combination of street violence, political protest, and a crippling economic boycott proved too much for the British government. British merchants, facing ruin, lobbied Parliament relentlessly. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. The repeal brought mass celebrations to the colonies, which viewed it as a magnificent victory for the cause of liberty. However, the Parliament had not conceded the core principle. On the very same day it repealed the Stamp Act, it passed the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament's full power and authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonists celebrated the practical victory of the repeal, but ignored the fundamental political warning embedded in the Declaratory Act. The crisis over taxation was momentarily resolved, but the conflict over sovereignty, who held ultimate governing power, was simply postponed. The fallow fields had been plowed by the Stamp Act and seeded with defiance, waiting for the next rain to bring forth the harvest of revolution.
The Midnight Ride and the Rising Tide, from Lexington to the Continental Congress. The uneasy peace that followed the repeal of the Stamp Act shattered completely a decade later. The final catalyst for war was the implementation of the Intolerable Acts, known to the British as the Coercive Acts, in 1774, which were Parliament's punitive response to the Boston Tea Party. These acts closed the vital port of Boston and stripped Massachusetts of its right to self-government, effectively placing the colony under military rule led by General Thomas Gage. The rest of the colonies, instead of abandoning Massachusetts, stood in solidarity, forming the First Continental Congress and boycotting British goods. The conflict had moved past taxes. It was now a struggle for liberty and political existence. Throughout New England, civilian militias, the Minutemen, drilled openly, stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in inland towns like Concord and Worcester. General Gage, trapped in Boston and tasked with restoring royal authority, knew he had to seize the rebel armories and capture the radical leaders, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. The warning system and the first shots. The decisive moment arrived on the night of April 18, 1775. Gage dispatched a column of 700 elite British troops on a secret mission to march to Concord. But the colonists' sophisticated network of spies and riders was faster. Dr. Joseph Warren, a key organizer, learned of the plan and sent a vital warning via the famous signal from the Old North Church, 2 lanterns indicating the British were crossing the Charles River by sea. The warning was carried on the midnight ride by Paul Revere and William Dawes, who rode through the night to awaken the countryside. Their frantic mission successfully alerted the Minutemen and roused colonial opposition. As the sun rose on April 19th, the British vanguard encountered Captain John Parker and about 77 armed Minutemen assembled on the Lexington Green. The situation was chaotic and volatile. A shot rang out. The source remains unknown, but it was the spark that ignited the war. The British troops, disciplined but enraged, fired volleys into the small, determined band of colonists. 8 Americans fell dead, and the British marched on, believing the rebellion was easily suppressed. This was the shot heard round the world, the moment when the political argument turned into a violent revolution. In Concord, the British encountered a larger, more organized colonial force at the North Bridge. This time, the Minutemen, having had time to assemble, fought back, driving the British regulars into retreat. The real damage to the Redcoats, however, occurred on the long march back to Boston. Thousands of militia members, emerging from the woods and behind stone walls, conducted a relentless guerrilla assault on the exhausted British column. The Redcoats suffered over 250 casualties, confirming that this was not a minor skirmish, but a full-scale uprising. The siege of Boston had begun, trapping Gage's army. The Continental Congress takes command. Just 3 weeks after the bloodshed, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775. The delegates, divided between reconciliation and outright war, faced the dilemma of governing a revolution that had already started. The Congress's first, most consequential action was to establish a unified military command. They transformed the disparate militias besieging Boston into the Continental Army, and, in a crucial move to ensure unity across the colonies, they appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief. Washington's reputation and status as a Southern planter ensured that the war would be seen as a unified, continental effort, not just a New England uprising. A month later, the war escalated dramatically at the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 1775. Colonial forces fortified Breed's Hill near Boston. The British, unwilling to tolerate this threat, launched 3 massive frontal assaults. The Americans, following the famous command, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," inflicted devastating casualties on the Redcoats. Though the colonists ultimately retreated due to lack of ammunition, the British suffered over 1,000 dead and wounded. This battle proved that American forces could fight effectively against the best army in the world, guaranteeing a long and brutal conflict. The final break, from loyalty to liberty. Despite the war raging around Boston, many delegates still harbored loyalty to the Crown. This led to the Olive Branch Petition in July 1775, a final humble plea to King George III for reconciliation. The king, however, refused even to read it. Instead, he declared the colonies to be in an open and avowed rebellion, and later announced the hiring of German Hessian mercenaries to crush the Americans. The king's declaration of war and his use of foreign troops destroyed the last hope for peace. Public opinion shifted irrevocably towards independence, a change cemented by the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776. Written in plain, accessible language, Paine viciously attacked the institution of monarchy and argued logically and passionately that separation was the only sensible course for the colonies. The pamphlet sold tens of thousands of copies, turning masses of colonists into committed revolutionaries. By the spring of 1776, state governments were forming independently of royal governors. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced the fateful resolution that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. After weeks of intense debate, Congress voted for independence on July 2, 1776. 2 days later, on July 4, 1776, they formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson. This document was a revolutionary manifesto, asserting the universal principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the right of the people to self-govern. The delegates, by signing the Declaration, mutually pledged their lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, transforming a regional rebellion into a world-changing war for the creation of a new, independent republic.